She waited 10 years. 10 long years of waking up in a house that felt too quiet, of setting one plate on the table instead of two, of watching other women get flowers on their birthdays while she got nothing but another ordinary day slipping through her fingers like dry Texas sand. And then one Tuesday morning in late October, someone knocked on her door. She almost didn't answer it. If you've ever felt like love just forgot your name, stay right here. This story is for you. And before we go any further, if you love slow, emotional Western romance stories that feel like home, go ahead and hit that subscribe button. We post new stories every week, and you don't want to miss a single one. Now let's go back to the beginning. Let's go back to Clara. Clara Matthews was 41 years old, and she lived alone on a 12-acre property just outside of Millbrook, a small, dust-colored town in West Texas that most people drove through without stopping. She had a modest white house with a sagging porch, a vegetable garden she tended more out of habit than joy, and a barn she hadn't opened since the last of her horses were sold 3 years ago to pay off a debt that wasn't even hers to begin with. She had been married once. His name was Gerald. They had wed young, when Clara was 27 and still believed that love was simple and permanent. Gerald was a traveling salesman who smiled too easily and promised too much. For the first 2 years, she had been happy. Or at least, she thought she had been. Looking back later, she realized she had been busy confusing activity with happiness. Gerald was always moving, always planning something, always heading somewhere. And one morning, 9 years into their marriage, he simply didn't come back from one of his trips. No note, no goodbye, no explanation. Just an empty closet and a bank account drained down to $43. Clara found out through a mutual acquaintance 8 months later that Gerald had started a new life in Arizona with a woman who was younger and less complicated, as the acquaintance awkwardly put it. Clara hadn't cried when she heard that. She had gone very still, like a field before a storm, and then she had walked outside, sat down on her porch steps, and looked out at the empty land around her for a very long time. After that, she stopped expecting anything from anyone. She kept her head down. She worked. She planted things and watched them grow. She volunteered at the town library on Wednesday afternoons. She baked pies she brought to church and accepted compliments without really hearing them. She smiled when she was supposed to smile and said she was fine when people asked, because saying anything else required more energy than she had. The years went by, 40, 41, and then came the knock. It was early, barely past 7 in the morning, and Clara was still in her kitchen robe, standing at the stove with a mug of black coffee and staring out at the October fog rolling low across her land. The knock was not loud or frantic. It was 3 steady, deliberate thumps, the kind made by someone who had decided to be there and wasn't going to apologize for it. Clara pulled her robe tighter and went to the door. The man standing on her porch was tall, broad across the shoulders. He had a worn brown hat pulled low and hands that looked like they had worked hard for a very long time. He had a few days of stubble on his jaw and dark eyes that looked directly at her without any of the nervous glancing away that most people did when she opened the door to them. He said, "Morning. I'm sorry to come by so early. My truck broke down about a half-mile up the road and my phone's been dead since Amarillo. I was wondering if I could use yours." His voice was low and unhurried, like someone who had learned long ago that there was no point in speaking faster than the world could listen. Clara looked at him for a moment. Then she stepped back and opened the door wider. She would think about that moment later. That simple instinct to step back and let him in. She couldn't explain it then, and she couldn't explain it later. There was just something about the steadiness of him that didn't feel threatening. He felt the way a big old tree feels in the middle of an open field. Solid, quiet, present. "Phone's on the wall," she said. "Coffee's on the stove if you want some." He took off his hat when he stepped inside. His name was James Holt. He was 46 years old and he was driving back to his ranch in the small town of Cowboy, about 90 miles east of Millbrook. He had been up in Amarillo helping a friend move equipment. He called a truck service from her phone, spoke in 3 short sentences, and hung up. Then he looked at the coffee pot. "May I?" he asked. "Help yourself," Clara said. He poured himself a cup and sat down at her kitchen table with the ease of someone who had no particular agenda and wasn't trying to be anything other than what he was. Clara stood by the counter and watched him drink the coffee, and for a strange reason she couldn't name, she felt more comfortable in her own kitchen right then than she had in years. They talked a little while he waited for the truck service. She learned that he had a ranch, a son named Thomas who was 9 years old and lived with him full-time since James's wife had passed away 3 years ago from a heart condition nobody had seen coming. 140 acres, some cattle, a few horses, and a lot of quiet. "Sounds lonely," Clara said before she could stop herself. James looked at her, not offended, just honest. "It is," he said. "But Thomas keeps it from being too quiet. Kids have a way of filling up space without even trying." Clara smiled a little at that. A real smile, not the Sunday church kind. The truck service came 40 minutes later. James thanked her at the door, hat in hand, and told her he appreciated her kindness. She told him it was nothing. He walked down her porch steps and she stood in the doorway and watched him go. She told herself that was the end of it. It wasn't. 3 days later there was another knock. This time she was in the garden, pulling up the last of the fall squash, and she almost missed it. When she came around the side of the house, she found James Holt standing on her porch again, holding a brown paper bag. "Figured coffee and a phone call deserved more than a thank you," he said. "Thomas helped me bake these apple turnovers. He wants to be a chef." A pause. "They might be a little burnt on one side." Clara looked at the bag, then at him. "You drove 90 miles to bring me apple turnovers?" He looked down at the bag and then back at her, and she could see the ghost of something in his expression. Something that was almost embarrassment but carried a kind of brave honesty beneath it. "The driving gave me time to think," he said simply. She let him in again. They sat at the kitchen table again with coffee and the slightly burnt turnovers, which were actually wonderful despite the edges, and they talked for 2 hours without either of them noticing the time passing. He told her about his ranch and the way the land looked at sunrise. She told him about her garden and the library, and the way she still hadn't figured out what to do with the empty barn. He didn't try to fix it or give advice. He just listened with the kind of attention that made her feel like what she was saying actually mattered. When he left that afternoon, she stood on the porch and watched his truck until she couldn't see the dust trail anymore. She went back inside and stood in her kitchen for a long moment. She was terrified. Not of James, not of anything he had done or said. She was terrified of herself. Terrified of the small, warm feeling that had started moving around in her chest like something waking up after a very long sleep. She knew that feeling. She had felt it once before, and she knew exactly what it could cost her. She decided not to encourage it. She was reasonably good at that decision for about 2 weeks. And then James called. He had gotten her number from the phone book, which she found both old-fashioned and oddly sweet. He said he was calling to ask if she might want to come see the ranch sometime. Thomas had asked about her, apparently. He had wanted to know if the lady with the coffee was nice, and James had told him yes, and now Thomas wanted to know if she liked horses. "Does she?" James asked. Clara was quiet for a moment. "I used to," she said. "I sold my last ones a few years ago." "We've got 4, James said. Thomas has been trying to name them all after breakfast foods. The bay mare is currently called Pancake." Clara laughed. "A real one. The kind that starts in your chest and comes out before you can make it polite." She said yes. She drove out to the Holt Ranch on a Saturday morning in mid-November when the sky was pale gray and the land was dusted with the first suggestion of cold. The ranch was exactly what she had pictured, and somehow more real than the picture. Wide and plain and honest. The main house was big and older with a covered porch that wrapped around 2 sides and a weather vane on the roof that squeaked when the wind caught it. There were horses in the paddock and the smell of wood smoke and hay in the cold air. Thomas came running out of the barn before James even made it to the porch to greet her. He was small for 9, with his father's dark eyes and a gap between his front teeth that made every smile look like a secret. He was wearing a flannel shirt 2 sizes too big and boots with 1 lace untied, and he stopped a few feet from Clara and looked at her with the kind of direct, evaluating gaze that only children and old men have the courage to use. "Are you the coffee lady?" he asked. "I suppose I am," Clara said. "Dad said you have an empty barn." "I do." Thomas considered this very seriously. "That seems sad," he said. "Barns are supposed to have things in them." Clara looked at James over the boy's head, and James was looking at his boots, but she could see the corner of his mouth turning up. "You're right," she told Thomas. "It does seem sad." Thomas nodded like this settled something, and then took her hand without asking and started pulling her toward the paddock. "Come meet Pancake," he said. "She likes people who smell like coffee." Clara went. The morning stretched into afternoon, and the afternoon slipped quietly into evening without any of them planning it. James made chili on the stove, and Thomas set the table with careful, deliberate placement of each fork and spoon, like it was a ceremony he took seriously. They ate together, and Thomas talked about school and horses and a book he was reading about a boy who became a lighthouse keeper, and Clara sat across that table in that warm kitchen surrounded by the smell of wood smoke and chili, and something she hadn't felt in so long she almost didn't recognize it. She felt like she belonged somewhere. She drove home that night in the dark and sat in her car in front of her quiet house for a long time before going inside. Things moved slowly after that, the way good things tend to when they're real. James came by Millbrook on Wednesday afternoons sometimes, which happened to be when Clara was at the library. He would wait on a bench outside and walk with her to the small diner on Main Street, where they would drink coffee and talk and occasionally sit in easy silence, the kind of silence you can only have with someone you're genuinely comfortable with. Thomas called her twice on the telephone, once to ask her favorite color because he was making something at school, once to tell her that Pancake had kicked over a water bucket and he thought she would want to know. She did want to know. December came in cold and clear, and then one afternoon James called her with a different kind of voice, quieter, careful. He told her that his neighbor, an older man named Walt who had owned the land bordering the Holt Ranch to the north for 30 years, had decided to sell. And the buyer was a property developer from Dallas who intended to build a road straight through the eastern edge of James's grazing land, which was apparently within his legal rights to do based on an old easement nobody had paid attention to in decades. James wasn't panicking, but she could hear something tight underneath the steadiness. "Can you fight it?" she asked. "I can try," he said, "but lawyers cost money I was planning to use for the barn repairs and Thomas's school fees." Clara was quiet. Then she said, "What do you need?" "I didn't call you to ask for anything," he said quickly. "I know you didn't," she said. "That's why I'm asking." There was a pause on the line. "Just someone to talk to," he said finally, and his voice had dropped into something honest and unguarded that made her chest ache. "I've been making decisions alone for 3 years and most of the time it's fine. Tonight it doesn't feel fine." "I'll come over," she said. She drove out in the cold dark and found him sitting on the porch with a lantern and a cup of coffee, and they sat together in the cold for a long time and talked it through, and she listened the way he had always listened to her, with her full attention and no agenda. And somewhere in the middle of that conversation, something shifted between them. Something quiet and irreversible. He reached over and put his hand over hers on the armrest of the porch chair. He didn't say anything. Neither did she. They sat like that for a long time in the cold dark with the lantern flickering and the horses quiet in the barn and the stars coming out one by one over the flat Texas land. The property dispute took 2 months to resolve. James found a lawyer who worked on partial payment, and Clara helped him sort through 30 years of land documents spread across his kitchen table on 3 separate evenings, her reading glasses on and a pen behind her ear, and Thomas asleep on the sofa under a quilt. They found the original easement document and discovered it had actually expired and was never properly renewed, a detail the Dallas developer had been counting on nobody catching. The developer walked away. James called her the morning after it was settled, and she could hear something released in his voice, like a breath held for a long time finally let go. "It's done," he said. "I know," she said. "I'm glad." A pause. "Clara," he said. "James, I'd like to take you somewhere. Not the diner. Somewhere that requires me to wear a shirt without dust on it." She smiled at her kitchen wall. "I think I can work with that," she said. He took her to a small restaurant in a town 40 miles away that had white tablecloths and candles and a piano player in the corner working through something slow and old-fashioned. James sat across from her in a clean shirt and his hair combed back, and she thought he looked almost unbearably good in the candlelight, which was a thought she kept carefully to herself. They talked about everything and nothing the way people do when they are really talking about something else entirely. At the end of the evening in the parking lot, he stood in front of her and looked at her in that direct, steady way of his and said, "I want to tell you something, and I need you to just let me say it." She waited. "I've been careful," he said. After Ellen died, I made Thomas a promise that I wouldn't bring anyone into our life unless I was sure. Unless it was real. I've never been someone who says things he doesn't mean, and I don't plan to start. He paused. You are real, Clara. What I feel when I'm with you is real. And I'm not going to pretend otherwise anymore. The parking lot was cold and her breath came out in small clouds, and the stars above the West Texas plain were enormous and brilliant, and she stood there and let herself feel everything she had been holding carefully at arm's length for 2 months. Let herself feel it, and not be afraid of it. I've been alone for 10 years, she said quietly. Not just since Gerald. Before that too, in ways I didn't know how to name. And I stopped believing this was something that happened to people like me. People like you? He said gently. Ordinary people, she said, who made mistakes, who got left. He stepped forward and took both her hands in his, and they were warm despite the cold night. You are not ordinary, he said, and whatever happened before wasn't your fault, and I'm not going anywhere. She believed him. Christmas came to the Holt Ranch with pine branches on the porch railing and Thomas's handmade paper decorations strung across the windows and a smell of cinnamon and wood smoke that Clara would remember for the rest of her life. She was there for Christmas morning. She watched Thomas tear into a small wrapped package and find inside it a book about lighthouse keepers, the one he had mentioned months ago, which she had tracked down through the library's interlibrary system and paid for quietly. He looked up at her with those dark eyes wide, and she braced herself for the formal child politeness that adults usually get. Instead, he crossed the room at a full run and threw his arms around her middle and pressed his face against her shoulder and said, in a muffled, fierce voice, "You remembered." "I remembered," she said. Her arms went around him and she held on. James was standing in the doorway to the kitchen watching, and when she looked over Thomas's head at him, he looked like a man watching something he had been waiting for without knowing he had been waiting for it. That evening, after Thomas had fallen asleep on the sofa again with his lighthouse book open on his chest, James sat beside her on the porch swing, and the cold was sharp, but they had a wool blanket across their laps, and the stars were out, and somewhere down in the barn, Pancake made a low sound in her sleep. "I want to ask you something," James said. Clara looked at him. "I want to ask you if you'd be willing to think about this, about all of it, about whether this might be something that becomes permanent." He spoke carefully, the way he always spoke, but she could hear the held breath underneath. "I'm not rushing anything. I know what it means to ask someone to take on a life that already has a shape. A boy who names horses after breakfast food and calls people on the telephone to report barn accidents. A ranch that needs work. A man who is better at being quiet than at saying the right thing." Clara was quiet for a moment. "You said the right thing just now," she said. He looked at her. "Thomas called me last week," she said. "He told me that Pancake had learned a new trick." And then he was quiet for a moment and he said, "It's nice having someone to call." And then he hung up. She paused. I sat with that for a long time. "Clara." "The answer is yes," she said. "To the thinking about it. To all of it." He reached over and tucked a piece of her hair back from her face with the same careful steadiness he brought to everything. And then he kept his hand there, warm against her cheek, and she leaned into it. They didn't need to say anything else. Spring came to the Holt Ranch the way it always does in Texas, sudden and golden and smelling of something new. The barn on Clara's property in Millbrook got 2 horses in it that season, on permanent loan from James, because Thomas had decided that empty barns were sad and someone needed to fix that. Clara drove out to the ranch 3 mornings a week and came home later and later, and eventually there was a small drawer in the guest room that had her things in it, and a mug on the shelf marked with her name in Thomas's uneven handwriting. On a Saturday in April, under the old oak tree in the yard of the Holt Ranch with the spring wind moving through the grass, and Thomas standing very straight in his good shirt with a ring he had helped pick out at the jeweler's in town, James Holt got down on one knee in front of Clara Matthews and asked her to stay. She didn't need 10 seconds to answer. The wedding was small. A few friends from Millbrook, James's sister from New Mexico, the pastor from the local church, and Thomas, who served as best man and cried in a way he later claimed was allergies. In the photographs from that day, Clara is not looking at the camera. She is looking at the boy standing beside her. And on his face is an expression that needs no explanation. She had waited 10 years. She had stopped hoping. And then one ordinary Tuesday morning, a quiet man with dust on his boots and honesty in his eyes knocked on her door, and everything that had been empty began, slowly and surely and beautifully, to fill. If this story touched something in you, I would love to know. Drop a comment below and tell me what part stayed with you the most. And tell me, where are you watching from tonight? There are people reading and listening from all over the world, and every single one of you belongs here. If you haven't subscribed yet, please do. There are more stories just like this one waiting for you. Stories about love that finds people when they've stopped looking, about belonging that comes when you least expect it, about quiet strength and second chances, and the kind of home you build in someone else's heart. Subscribe and come back whenever you need a story that feels like a warm light on a cold night. We'll be here.